In their now famous dialogue of 1986, one of the key disagreements between Benjamin Buchloh and Gerhard Richter came towards the end when looking together at an abstract painting. I don't know which painting it was, but these are two that they might have been looking at. Richter told Buchloh that the paintings, quote, remind you of natural experiences, even rain if you like. The paintings can't help functioning that way. That's where they get their effect from, the fact that they incessantly remind you of nature. And they're almost naturalistic anyhow. We only find paintings interesting because we search for something that looks familiar to us. I see something in my head and try to find out what it relates to. Buchloh strongly objected, and in his response targeted what he called the romantic element in Richter's thinking. Whereas earlier artists such as Mondrian had made abstractions whose structures could be seen as utopian analogies for non-hierarchical social orders, Richter was, to quote Buchloh, unable to visualize a utopian construct of a society that would match this ideal of nature. For Richter, nature was the only analogy or model that is ordered without a hierarchical structure. Richter could only fall back on the metaphor of nature like a romantic. And those last words were also Buchloh's. Now, many writers have looked back to Buchloh's interview with Richter since 1986, but few have probed the questions at stake in this particular interchange about abstraction and naturalistic connotations. Maybe because they shared Buchloh's criticism about Richter's disinterest in utopian social models. Maybe because they agreed with Buchloh's assessment that Richter was falling back on a conservative idea of nature, but probably because they also shared Buchloh's embarrassment about Richter's claim that some abstract paintings reminded him of natural phenomena like rain. There are historical sources for this embarrassment, and we can go back to the reception of Jackson Pollock's titles like Autumn Rhythm and Lavender Mist. Though some of these titles were actually given by Clement Greenberg, modernist critics, himself included, wanted to stress the achievements of Pollock's work in terms of forms and processes, and feared that these literary and metaphorical titles would encourage facile readings of the paintings. Viewers, they thought, could fixate on these titles, and the paintings might be reduced to them. The spills and splatters of Pollock's paint would no longer be seen as radical assaults on the verticality of painting, and instead would be viewed as mere landscape effects. And there was this massive debate in the 80s at the time of Buchloh's interview with Richter around what to make of Pollock's work. And I think Rosalind Krauss, who was supervising Buchloh's PhD at this time, was the person most clearly fighting for an abstract view of Pollock, her essay Reading Jackson Pollock Abstractly, against the kind of an interpretation that would take seriously a title like Lavender Mist. Anyway, just so the critical negativity of Richter's abstractions would be undermined if we concluded our account of them by saying that some of them look a bit like waterfalls, and you can see on the painting on the right, that sort of waterfall or ray of light, and the painting on the left, a sort of red rain. Anyway, but surely we can look at the exchange raised by this interchange between Buchloh and Richter again, and we can ask some important questions. Is Richter really thinking in a simplistic way when he claims that abstract works remind him of nature? Or are the relationships more profound? And is Buchloh misunderstanding Richter's ideas about nature when Buchloh claims that Richter sees nature in a romantic way as an ahistorical and non-hierarchical and in complete opposition to society? What if Richter's approach to nature and the natural is inseparable from his approach to history? Now, for a while, I want to leave these questions hanging and to look backwards and forwards from this moment of 1986 at Richter's use of titles to name abstract works as it is through titles that he sometimes demonstrates most clearly how these analogies between abstraction and nature work for him. Now, we all know that Richter had been making abstractions since the 1950s, as Luke's paper clarified, but as Nick's paper clarified, the series he referred to as the abstract pictures began in earnest in the mid-70s, or mid to late 70s. Now, most abstract pictures are not titled, but one of the first that is titled is Parachute from 1977. And according to the artist, the painting was christened by Conrad Fischer when he visited the studio. And here it really is a simple relationship of casual resemblance between the form in the painting, so that yellow parachute and the strings going down, and a real parachute. In 1982, Richter made a painting with a trapezoid form in it, and I'm thinking of the red form towards the left. Now, you see those forms in a lot of paintings of this time. In our show, there's two in the top corner of the painting called Junie. But Richter added two strokes to that trapezoid form and then called it Tisch. Because of, again, a quite simple visual resemblance between a table and that form. Now, parachute and table are very simple kinds of titles, and they're the exceptions to the rule. Elsewhere, there's a more complex relationship. Sometimes, for instance, the title refers to people. We can conjecture, for instance, that Gudrun from 1987, which was made a year before Richter painted Gudrun Ensslin, was so named because the strong red squidgy mark connected in Richter's mind to the Red Army faction. That's conjecture. But mostly titles refer to nature. For instance, Clouds from 1982, Rain from 1988, Forest, a sequence of 4 paintings, we've got 2 in the show, from 1990, and River from 1995. Now, in order to look more closely at the relationship between abstraction and such naturalistic titles, I want to concentrate on one small group of 4 works from 1989 that I consider to be amongst the absolute pinnacles of Richter's achievement with abstraction, and they are Fels, or rock, Fluss, river, Kurs, and which means course, and Atem, which means breath. But I really want to concentrate on these 2. So these 4 paintings are all made on vertical canvases, 3 meters high and 2.5 meters wide. This towering and imposing format is important to their meaning and differentiates them from other squeegee works which are either landscape in orientation or square. In these 4 works, as in others, the squeegee produces different effects over the surfaces. Striations, rips, and flecks characterize other paintings, but in all 4 of these, the final pull of the squeegee traveled downwards rather than across, and so the striations and tears and flecks traveled downwards too. Again, this is different from other works from this time, both horizontal and vertical canvases, where the final squeegee move was lateral, like in the forest ones I showed just before. To describe the effect of these works, I think it's helpful to contrast the downward rips in these paintings to other downward drifts in post-war abstraction. The abstract expressionist drip, the trammels in Maurice Lewis's unfurled paintings, and then the drooping wall-based sculptures that Eva Hess, Robert Morris, and Richard Serra were making around 1967 to 68. Now, the drip running off a brush stroke in a painting by Klein or de Kooning is an intended result of loading a brush with too much paint and wiping it across the surface very quickly, and it's retained on the surface to signal the spontaneity of the painter's movements. That's a bit of a cliched argument, I have to say. In fact, in this painting by de Kooning, there are drips which are also running up the way, which show that he turned the canvas over as he made it. By contrast, the downward trails of thinned acrylic paint in Lewis's works are intensely controlled and created in the service of careful colour combinations. They no longer signal bravado. Finally, in post-minimalist works such as Richard Serra's Belts, Robert Morris's Felts, and Eva Hesse's Ought, materials tumble to the floor as gravity acts on them. Here we're less inclined to think about the artist's subjectivities or compositional facilities, and indeed these have become irrelevant. Instead, we're faced with real materials which collapse because of their material properties. Now, Richter's downward squeegee pulls signify in different ways from all these models. Unlike the abstract expressionist gesture, the squeegee drag is slow, not quick. The paint does not travel because it is liquid, but because it was dragged down. Unlike Lewis, Richter cannot really control the appearance that this movement will produce. And unlike the post-minimalist collapse, there is more going on here than a painterly process and an exploration of materiality. The downward pulls in these particular squeegee paintings are so deliberate and are felt so viscerally because of the scale of the paintings. That's to say that in front of the works, one can feel a sense of a downward pull in one's own body. Now, Richter's squeegee abstracts like this, with their vertical trails, recall the look of destruction. I'm thinking of charred marks on burnt walls or melting metal. They are also reminiscent of cultural mourning practices, ripping one's clothes during mourning, the waterfalls in the newly built memorials to the Twin Towers, and of the physical markers of grief like crying or collapsing to the ground. And I think it would be as wrong to dismiss these associations out of hand as it would be to reduce the works to them. But what happens when we connect the physical sense of being dragged down with these ideas and with Richter's invitation to us to think about the titles and about the natural world? It should be clear that the titles of these works do not operate like the title Parachute, evoking a simple resemblance between the painting and the natural entity that the title names. The titles operate in a more complex way. There is first a material connection between the title and the painting. Looking at Fells, rock, you have a sense of the mineral quality of Richter's paint, and you recognize that pigment is ground up rock. Looking at Fluss or river, one feels that the flow of a river over rocks is physically similar to the pulling of paint over the bumpy ground of dried paint. More significantly, the titles help us articulate the effects that the paintings produce, but only if we read these words against the grain. So rock, breath, coarse flow. Looking at these paintings, I imagine being pulled downwards in a river, or a feeling of breathlessness, or what it is like to face a vertical and impenetrable rock face and to imagine falling off it. So the paintings encourage us to think about a brutal and inhumane idea of nature, rather than a cosy or beautiful ideal. They may indeed give us a better idea of Richter's approach to nature than the more recognizable landscapes that he made around the same time, such as Trees in a Field from 1988 or Country Path from 1987, which were the kinds of works that Richter referred to as, quote, untruthful in his notes of 1986, because such paintings, quote, such paintings glorify the way we look at nature, whereas, and this is the quote, nature in all its forms is always against us because it knows no meaning, no pity, no sympathy, because it knows nothing and is absolutely mindless, the total antithesis of ourselves, absolutely inhuman. Now, hopefully it's clear now why the Richter-Buchloh conversation about naturalistic references in abstract paintings is so misleading. In the conversation, Richter, for his part, failed to articulate how nuanced was his thinking about the relationship between abstraction and natural experiences. And Buchloh, for his part, wrongly imputed to Richter a touchy-feely idea of nature. Now, what I want to ask now is where Richter's more brutal vision of nature comes from. How did he come to have this idea of nature and the idea that informs abstract paintings like rock and river and forest? and underlies his statement about nature that I just quoted. Could this idea of nature be historically produced? And here I turn to the opening minute, or minute and a half, of Alain René's film Night and Fog from 1955, which I think begins to answer this question. So the VHS, please. Okay, can you stop that? And then if we can just also then note that this idea of starting a film off with that kind of footage was continued, and now just the first 10 seconds or so of Claude Lanzmann's monumental film Shoah. And really we're just going to watch the very, very first few seconds. Okay, thank you very much. Georges Didi Huberman has written a book titled Images in Spite of All, which concerns photographs of Auschwitz. In that book, Didi Huberman writes that, quote, not one single view exists of Crematorium 5, situated in a copse of birch trees, from which Birkenau gets its name, that is not obscured by some plant barrier. Later, he refers to a curtain of trees around the camp. Didi Huberman reproduces two photographs taken of the hedge and the trees used to camouflage Crematorium 5, but his book concentrates on the only 4 photographs known to exist which show the workings of the crematoria. These were taken by members of the Sonderkommando, Jews placed in the position of overseeing the activities of the camp. And one of these was recruited into the resistance. A camera somehow was smuggled into the camp, and only 4 images were taken. These two, from actually within the gas chamber, looking towards other Sonderkommandos burning recently killed people, with trees in the distance, and 2 taken just outside, the camera obviously now held at the hip and now tilted, with the tree where trees dominate, but where a group of women are undressed at the bottom and being herded towards the gas chamber. And the last image is blurred and indistinct. Of this third image, Didi Huberman writes that, quote, the greyish blur of this image resembles the ashes that these beings in motion will soon become. Now, it is while Richter's own work was characterized by a greyish blur, while his paintings were, that he began to look at these very images. Indeed, the third of the 4 images taken by the Sonderkommando appears, cropped and oriented vertically, in panel 19 of atlas, and it's the one on the bottom left, where it appears with other images that were included in Night and Fog. Now, those three have been rephotographed blurred, but the one from the Sonderkommando was blurred to begin with. In the next panel of Atlas, Richter hand-tinted the photographs. While his recognition that it was impossible to make a painting based on these photographs has been a part of the literature on Richter for a long time, not that much has been said about this act of colouring in. Was it an act of provocation that he withdrew from, just as he decided not to make an exhibition collaboratively with Konrad Lug, pairing images of the camps with pornographic material? Or was Richter suggesting that the only way to see these images was somehow to prevent them from becoming too familiar as black and white documents? And was he thinking that colour somehow could sharpen the horror? Or was Richter indicating something instead about the randomness of colour that he would explore more fully in the colour charts, that colour no longer could just be associated with harmony or chromatic joy? The problem of colour and the problem of these images have sometimes seemed connected for Richter. Indeed, he returned to these images in 1997 in his proposals for the Reichstag lobby, and also considered installing a colour chart. Benjamin Buchloh has recently suggested that Richter decided not to use the images of the corpses, as if in acknowledgement that the moment you fix an image in a memorial, it becomes easier to forget. And this argument reminds me of Jean-François Lyotard's idea that only that which is inscribed can be forgotten, and that therefore it's imperative to keep memory alive by not inscribing the past through too easily consumable texts and images. It's my argument, ultimately, that for Richter, the problem of nature is bound up with the images of the camps, that Richter's approach to nature is coloured by his confrontation with these images, and that the trees around Birkenau, which again it's worth saying gets its name from birch trees, haunt the forests in his works. In another panel from Atlas, Richter created a column of 3 photographs that he took himself of Buchenwald, whose name, created by the Nazis, translates as beech forest. You see the main building twice, and then the row of trees planted to conceal it. On the walls of Richter's studio, to this day, there is a framed photograph of the image, a framed rephotographed image of the first photograph of the group of 4 that Didi Huberman discusses. I saw it there during the research for the show, but this is now a matter of public record as it appears in Corina Beltz's film. Richter also discusses the image, as well as Didi Huberman's book, with Nicholas Serota in the interview for our catalogue. Richter said that the Sonderkommando look like nice gardeners, before you realise that they aren't moving and burning autumn leaves. He said, there is an appalling contrast between the contents and the look of the picture. He didn't say it, but surely one appalling aspect of the picture is the forest at the back. This is the forest that we see dominating the images in other photographs, where we might even see the forest before we see the women running towards their deaths. Richter once said that his grey monochrome paintings of the 70s were the only way for me to paint concentration camps. It is impossible to paint the misery of life, except maybe in grey to cover it. It's also been suggested by Kaja Silverman that the inability to paint the images of the camps was later taken up in his decision to paint images of members of the Red Army faction. But perhaps we could also suggest that even though Richter cannot paint the bodies, he also cannot paint forests and rivers without also thinking about the forests that concealed the camps and the rivers into which the ashes of destroyed bodies were dumped. We could continue this line of thinking suggested by Buchloh. Perhaps it is only in certain groups of abstract paintings that Richter manages to summon memories tentatively and to keep memory away from inscription. As I said before, Richter's Wald or forest paintings of 1990, which were included in our show, I didn't say this, but they seem to recall the experience of moving past a forest rather than the look of trees. But in a later series, also called Wald, or Forest, dating from 2005 and comprising 12 paintings, the look of a forest becomes more evident. The paintings started out with brushed primaries, brushed quickly over the canvases. Several layers of darker paint were applied, spread out with a squidgy, partially erased, repainted and pulled over the colours again, scraped back again. On most of the works, by this time, the bright underlayers were almost obscured completely. Richter then took a broad brush to the paintings, a brush not coated with paint, and mostly pulled down in a series of vertical strokes. In some works in this series, these strokes summon up basic tree trunk forms. Through this dense thicket, there are occasional flashes of colour and light, but mostly the view behind these bars is darker than the stroke trees themselves. Counterintuitively, the view through the tree forms seems to be a view onto darkness, not light. As we feel this paradox, a sense of impenetrability and concealment increases. The forest once stood for protection, sanctuary, and home, but it is a very different place now. Thank you.